Thank you, Peter, for the kind invitation to be here. I've known Peter for quite some time. When I first got to know him, Peter still had long hair. I think you even had it pulled back into a ponytail. So I won't say any more than that. But it's always great to reconnect with Peter. It's lovely to meet some of his students. And let me also say at the beginning, thank you for letting me speak in English. I did take some French in school, but it's not good enough to give this presentation. So thank you for that as well. I'm going to talk about a particular type of risk today, which we might call biological risks. And I'm really going to break the talk down into kind of 2 or 3 different parts. So first of all, I'm going to spend some time talking to you about what we might consider the kind of conventional security agenda around biological risks and where that has come from. But then really in the main part of the talk, I want to focus on a kind of new axis of biological risk that has become much more important in recent years. I want to illustrate those through a set of biological scientific experiments. And then I'm going to try to draw out some wider conclusions about the relationships between science and security. And the main message, what I'm going to be arguing, kind of in terms of the talk as a whole, is so what I really, I think, want to say is that the role of science in security today is not just important, but it's actually constitutive. What I mean by this is that what we today mean by security, what it means to be insecure, how we provide security, can no longer be separated out from science. That's the kind of headline message that I want to get across. But let's start with the conventional notion of biological risk, or what some people call health security. I've gone back over the past kind of 2 decades and just picked out some symbolic moments that really capture this transition. And so the first stop is in America, in New York. We're going to go to Manhattan, and we're going to go to the United Nations Security Council. Many of you will be familiar with this, one of the highest and most important security institutions in the world. But I want to go back to this particular meeting. This is a meeting that occurred on the 10th of January 2000. So it's almost 2 decades ago now, but it was a very important meeting that people still talk about today. It was the 10th of January 2000. This means it was the first meeting of the Security Council in the 21st century. Okay, so there's a lot of symbolism attached to this. We just transitioned into the 21st century. We're setting out the new security agenda for the 21st century. You can see very high-level attendees in the background. You can see Kofi Annan, who was then the Secretary General of the UN. And of course, you can also see chairing the session Al Gore, who at the time was Vice President of the United States, serving under President Clinton, and who was himself engaged in a presidential campaign. Now, this meeting is important because of the topic that they were discussing. A topic of this Security Council meeting was the threat that HIV/AIDS poses to international peace and security. This is important because it was the first time in the history of the Security Council ever that a health issue or disease was considered to be a security threat. Okay? Many of you will know, normally the Security Council deals with guns and bombs issues, with the Middle East, with nuclear proliferation, with terrorism, doesn't normally deal with health issues. This was an exception. Does anybody here know why they would talk about HIV/AIDS as a security issue? I mean, HIV/AIDS is a disease. What does that have to do with security? Most people don't know why, so you don't have to feel bad. But there are 3 reasons why they were talking about it. Number 1, the primary mode of HIV transmission at the time was sexual transmission. And there were some data, sketchy data, but data to indicate that militaries, in particular, had very high levels of HIV prevalence. There are some estimates that indicated that there were militaries in sub-Saharan Africa where HIV prevalence in the armed forces was more than 50%. This was at a time when medicines for HIV were not widely available. So there were real questions in terms of what would happen to these militaries as people began to die from AIDS-related illnesses. Militaries have a high-risk culture. They're often a very mobile population. They're deployed from their home for long periods of time. They often interact with sex workers, another high-risk group for HIV transmission. So there were all kinds of reasons why the militaries might have elevated levels of HIV. But that was one important link between HIV and security. A second one was that if you move beyond the military and also look at the civilian population, at the time there were some countries where HIV prevalence, even in the normal civilian population, was approaching 30% of the adult population. Okay? Again, in a context where medicines were not widely available, what would happen to these societies as their technicians, as their lawyers, as their economists, as their laborers gradually all succumb to AIDS? Huge questions about state stability and what would happen to the economic viability of these societies in the long run. So that was the second link. There was also a third link, and this is also where geopolitics comes in a little bit, and that is that the Security Council for many decades after the Second World War was paralyzed because you had the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both of them had veto powers. And so although originally the plan was that the United Nations would have its own army, this plan never got off the ground because of divisions within the Security Council. After the end of the Cold War, more cooperation became possible, and you got a proliferation of peacekeeping operations, which were launched by the Security Council. So you got many, many more peacekeeping operations suddenly happening under the auspices of the United Nations. And there was a real scramble to find peacekeepers because the UN doesn't have its own military. It has to go to individual member countries and say, can you give us some soldiers to serve as blue helmets to be peacekeepers for the United Nations? And so initially, a lot of peacekeepers came from Scandinavian countries, from Canada, from these kind of countries, but the pool grew larger and larger to the point where it was becoming clear that some of the countries that were sending peacekeepers to serve for the United Nations were coming from those same militaries that were estimated to have very high HIV prevalence rates. And so there were real concerns that inadvertently, United Nations peacekeeping operations could actually serve as a vector for transmitting HIV. As soldiers go from one country to another, maybe also interact with sex workers, have free time, whatever, all kinds of things can go on. And so there was real concern that the United Nations was actually also inadvertently playing a role. And you didn't want to be in a situation where you're trying to launch peacekeeping operations to stabilize conflict situations, at the same time actually serving as a vector of HIV. Okay? So, in retrospect, this was a hugely significant moment for kind of bridging the worlds of health and security. This meeting on HIV/AIDS. Now I want to give you a second event or a second date. Remember, this meeting was in 2000. So we're going to fast forward now just over a year to 2001 and to February 2001. And we're going to go all the way across the world to Hong Kong. Anybody here been to Hong Kong? Yes? 1, 2? Okay. So those of you who know to Hong Kong, you know nowadays when you land in Hong Kong, you land on Hong Kong Island, but you can go across the famous bay, and then you're in Kowloon, which is just on the north side of the bay. What you're looking at here is a hotel in Kowloon. It's a fairly good hotel. I think the official rating is about 4-star. In February 2001, a Chinese national who's just arrived in Hong Kong checks into this hotel. Dr. Lu Jinlun. He's a doctor, but he was traveling to Hong Kong because his daughter was getting married. So he was actually quite excited to come to Hong Kong and see his daughter getting married. But he was also a bit feverish and he wasn't feeling too well. So he checks into the hotel. He's given a room on the 9th floor room 911. He gets in the lift, he goes up to the 9th floor, and somewhere, either in the lift or outside the lift, he becomes sick, he throws up, he goes to his room, and over the next couple of days, his condition would rapidly deteriorate, and he would die. So it turns out that this Dr. Lu Junlan, who was a doctor in southern China, had been treating patients before he came to Hong Kong. And he wasn't quite sure what these patients had. They just had kind of, we call it atypical pneumonia. So they had pneumonia, like a respiratory illness, but it wasn't quite sure. There are many things that can cause it. It wasn't quite sure what would cause it. They would later figure out that actually what these guys had were some of the first cases of human infection with a new coronavirus that leads to something called severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS for short. Okay? So he was one of the first guys to have SARS. Also staying at this hotel at the same time are tourists, because it's in a popular tourist location. Also staying at this hotel are very many international business travelers, because as you can see, it's a decent hotel. Hong Kong has a lot of financial interests. Some airlines are even using this hotel to put up their flight crews between legs, flying in and out of Hong Kong. So within hours, this new virus is on its way from Hong Kong to other destinations in Asia, and eventually as far away as Europe, North America, and so forth. In the end, they found over 8,000 laboratory-confirmed cases of SARS around the world. Over half of them traced back to this one guy, Dr. Lu Junlan, who checked into this hotel. He's called a super spreader. Last time I was in Hong Kong, I couldn't resist. I had to visit this hotel. They've renamed the hotel. They've gotten rid of room 911. 911 doesn't exist anymore. They've renumbered it 913. I went to the concierge and I asked, can I please see this room? And he just rolled his eyes, because there's a steady stream of macabre tourists who come just to see this hotel room, because for people who are interested in infectious diseases, it has such big significance. People are willing to pay 2 or 3 times the normal rate just to stay in this room. Okay? But unlike HIV/AIDS, right? When we just talked about HIV/AIDS, they were very clear links to the conventional security agenda, right? We're talking about, with HIV, we're talking impact on the military, we're talking about potential impact on state stability, we were talking about peacekeeping operations. With SARS, the financial consequences of this disease were massive. I mean, if you go, this would have been probably before your time, but at the time, if you were going to Hong Kong, people are staying in their homes, they're not going to restaurants, they're not going shopping. The big Hong Kong conventions, people are pulling out, so business meetings are not happening. Cathay Pacific, the big Hong Kong-based airline, is flying empty 747s in and out of Hong Kong. The economic damage was massive. So SARS went kind of a little bit further even than HIV/AIDS, because it became clear to people that nowadays in a context of globalization, an infectious disease outbreak like this is a threat to security, even if it doesn't affect the military, right? Just because of the financial and social consequences of the debilitating fear for a new disease for which there was no cure, leading to all kinds of havoc. And just as the dust is settling on SARS, in 2003, we get another event. We get pandemic flu, H5N1. H5N1 is a virus that predominantly affects birds. That's why it's called bird flu. In fact, if you're a bird, this virus is very bad news, because the mortality rate for birds is nearly 100%, usually within 48 hours. Okay? But what was also happening in 2003, the fact that it affects birds is bad for the birds, and it's bad for the humans who need birds because they're their livelihoods, or because they have businesses around poultry or eggs. But what was also happening is that some people who were in close contact with these birds were also contracting the virus. So there were also in 2003 human cases of infection with H5N1. according to WHO, the mortality of the virus in humans was around 60%. That's 60%. 6 out of 10 humans who get this died. The only good news at the time was that the virus did not seem to spread very easily from human to human. Okay, it was only the people who were coming in close direct contact with the birds who were getting the infection. But of course the fear was, if you have a virus with this mortality rate and it mutates and it begins to spread from person to person in a kind of chain reaction, you could have a massive pandemic. And so we get all this pandemic preparedness around H5N1, we get the development of new vaccines, we get stockpiling of antiviral medications, and we begin to look much more closely at how birds travel. These are the bird highways. So this is how, you don't usually think about this as a security risk, but from a bird flu point of view, you actually need to know where the birds fly, because that's where the transmission patterns will go. In the end, the H5N1 pandemic did not happen, but instead we got this, H1N1 or swine flu. Okay, so it didn't come from the chickens, and that became the first influenza pandemic of the 21st century, and a famous declaration by Margaret Chan, the Director General of the World Health Organization, declaring the start of the pandemic. Last but not least, just a few years ago, we then got another outbreak. This time Ebola. Ebola had been around for many decades, mostly in Central Africa, usually in quite remote rural locations. So although it's quite a vicious and unpleasant virus, it was quite easily contained. What happened 2014, though, was that all of a sudden it showed up in West Africa, in Guinea, but in a border region with Sierra Leone and Liberia. Emile Uamuno, who's the baby here, 2-year-old child, probably bitten by a bat, contracted Ebola virus, passed it on to his parents, who would also die from Ebola, leading eventually to the largest Ebola outbreak in human history with more than 10,000 deaths just a few years ago. Many of you will remember this from the news. And almost as if we're coming full circle, of course, the Ebola outbreak then again also became the subject of another Security Council meeting, reaffirming the importance and the links between outbreaks and security. Okay? So all we're trying to say here is that really over the course of the past 2 decades, there's been a big expansion of security agenda to include health issues and biological risks. And the fear of natural outbreaks, natural infectious disease outbreaks, is one big axis or driver of this transformation. And here you can see, I'm sorry it's a little bit fuzzy, but you can see the number of different, there are many more that I haven't talked about, but you get the idea. In a context of growing circulation, exchange, movement, there's growing fear that new infectious disease outbreaks can rapidly move and spread. There's also, though, a second related but separate axis of biological risks and danger that are becoming more important. And to illustrate this, I want to go back to the United States. I want to go back to the East Coast, but not to New York, but I want to go just around 100 miles south of New York to New Jersey, to the town of Trenton. Anybody know what's important about this photograph? The important thing are the 3 blue mailboxes. Okay? These mailboxes, you find them all over the United States. Any state you go to, you see these blue mailboxes. Box standard. Nothing extraordinary. 18th September 2001, so just about a week after the 9/11 attacks, somebody puts these into those mailboxes. So here we have a couple letters. Let's look first at who they're addressed to. High-profile political and media people. So we have Senator Daschle, who's a famous senator in America. You have Tom Brokaw, who is a big news anchor. He hosts, the famous U.S. news programs. And you have the editor of the New York Post, which is a large circulation kind of daily newspaper in New York. If you look at the envelopes of the papers, you can see that they are made to look quite innocent. In fact, if you look at the left, the one all the way at the left, if you look in the top corner, you can see that the return address is the 4th grade of an elementary school. Okay? So the letters are supposed to look as though children who are at an elementary school wrote them. You open the letters, you find these threatening messages, and you also find a white powder. And the white powder, turns out, was anthrax. The next slide is a little bit graphic. It shows what happens to people when they get anthrax. So if you're squeamish, look away, please. So we had a situation where all of a sudden you had people at the highest political level in the United States, including national security advisors, vice presidents, not knowing whether they had been exposed to the anthrax, having to be monitored and medically evaluated. A lot of fear, shutting down a Congress. I think about 5 people died as a result. But of course, it's not just the high-level VIPs that were under threat. Because the letters passed through the normal mailing system, the whole machinery, you also had to decontaminate the entire postal system where these letters had been posted, because normal postal workers just carrying the mail or working in the machines could have also been exposed, yeah? Okay? So this is important because it shows the second axis of biological risks or dangers. And that's not a natural outbreak, but it's a deliberate release, okay? There's growing concerns on the back of anthrax and other events as well as concerns about what Al-Qaeda might be up to, et cetera, about an intentional biological release. And they often refer to these as kind of twin biological dangers, natural outbreaks and deliberate releases. So much so that we end up with this new agenda around biological dangers and health security. And just to illustrate how important this is, so don't just take my word for it. Here's President Obama, how we miss him, talking about addressing the United Nations. And we must come together to prevent and detect and fight every kind of biological danger, whether it's a pandemic like H1N1, a terrorist threat, or a treatable disease. So you can see how all this is kind of being wrapped into an agenda around biological danger and health security. Now, this is the kind of the context within which I now want to take you guys and to explore a third axis of biological risk that is not talked about very much, but that is becoming increasingly important, especially in the last few years. Okay? And in order to explain this third axis, we're going to go back to H5N1, so back to bird flu. So here's just a kind of microscopic image of a cluster of H5N1 viruses. We're going to go back to Hong Kong that we talked about earlier. So the first human cases of H5N1 infection actually occurred in 1997. Okay? There were about 18 human cases. I think about 6 of them died. Another graphic image coming up showing you what happens to the chickens. Hong Kong authorities at the time took a very drastic line on this. They went into the markets to disinfect the birds, and there was also mass culling of birds to deal with the threat. And so for many years after 1997, the threat actually disappeared. In 2003, though, as I mentioned earlier, human cases reemerged in Hong Kong and also spread to other parts in Asia. Okay, and there was really a fear. Many people went back and looked at, for example, the 1918 flu pandemic. There were 3 major flu pandemics in the 20th century. Here's some historical pictures. And there was really fear that this could be the beginning of a new flu pandemic in the 21st century. As everybody geared up and is now stockpiling vaccines, stockpiling medicines, running simulation exercises to simulate the pandemic threat, drawing up contingency plans, how we would respond, despite all of these preparations, the H5N1 pandemic did not happen. It just didn't come. And so people began to wonder, will it actually ever happen? Is it possible that maybe these H5N1 viruses can't become pandemic? And that we're wasting all this money in preparedness? Maybe we missed something. And so in this context, two scientists that I want to introduce you to now, they're very important, main protagonists in the story that's about to follow. Two scientists decided to do some experiments with H5N1 viruses. On the right, let me introduce you first to the people before I tell you about the experiment. So on the right, we have Ron Fouchier, who's a Dutch scientist. Ron is, this picture is actually a little bit deceiving because they're standing on stairs. Ron is really tall. He's about 6'7", so even taller than me. So when I talk to him, I have to look up to Ron. But he's Dutch. Yoshi is Japanese. Yoshi Kawaoka. They're standing here in the same picture, but they're actually part of two separate scientific teams. So Ron works at the Erasmus Medical Center in Rotterdam. That's about 500 kilometers away from here. Yoshi works in Madison, Wisconsin, in the United States. You can see his facilities there. Here's a picture of Yoshi in action in his laboratory. And so what Yoshi and Ron wanted to do is they wanted to design experiments to see whether they could artificially introduce mutations into these H5N1 viruses to make them airborne transmissible. Okay, because remember, that's that airborne transmissibility that was the missing link in a pandemic, right? If they can't go airborne transmissible, then it's unlikely we would have a pandemic. If they can, then the chances of a pandemic are real. Now, Ron and Yoshi did different, well, first of all, let me say, you can't do these experiments with humans, because the mortality rate of H5N1 is so high. So what they do is they use animal models for these kinds of experiments. And they use an animal, I'm going to show you a picture in a second, called a ferret. Ferrets don't look anything like human beings. But for decades, influenza scientists have used ferrets as models because ferrets have a lot of similarities in terms of their respiratory system with human beings. So ferrets can actually transmit human flu viruses. Ferrets also sneeze the way humans sneeze when you have a cold. So they're an accepted animal model for humans. And so I said, okay, because it's so dangerous, these viruses, we're going to do it with animals. So Ron and Yoshi did different types of experiments. Ron took H5N1 viruses and passaged them through ferrets multiple times to generally accumulate mutations. Yoshi combined bits of H5N1 with the H1N1 pandemic virus to create a new kind of hybrid virus. Okay? So they did it in different ways. This is a nice picture of the ferrets. Okay? And the idea is that you have two ferrets in separate cages. You have the cage on the left and you have the cage on the right. The ferrets cannot touch each other. Okay? The only thing is that there are little holes in the walls between the two cages. And you can also, if you want, you can produce a little bit of a gentle wind, like a breeze to get through there. But if you introduce one of these H5N1 viruses into the ferret on the left, and then you see subsequently that the ferret on the right also becomes infected, then you know you have an airborne transmissible H5N1 virus. There's no other way that it can get there other than through the air. So Yoshi and Fuji separately, they did their separate experiments, and they both produced airborne transmissible versions of these viruses. So in the name of better preparing us for a future pandemic, they in effect called into being the very viruses that everybody was afraid nature might produce on its own. And because it's great science, they wrote up their findings of how they did this and submitted it to leading scientific journals. One of them sent it to Nature, the other sent it to Nature, the other one sent it to Science. These are two of the leading scientific publications in the world for publication. Before these studies were published, the editors of the journals took the decision to refer these manuscripts to an organization called the NSABB, which is the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity. Okay. This was a board that had been set up a few years earlier to advise the US government about scientific research that is dual use. Okay, so this is experiments that can generate useful knowledge, but that could also produce knowledge that could be put to very bad use if it got into the wrong hands. We're dealing here with lethal viruses, right? We're dealing here with viruses that have now had this additional ability to spread through the air. Ron, when he presented this, reportedly talked about how he had mutated the hell out of H5N1 viruses and produced probably the most dangerous viruses on Earth. Huh? So the journals are going, well, before we publish this, we're going to talk to NSABB whether we should really publish this. NSABB deliberates for many hours. NSABB is about 23 people, taken from different sectors. Should we, shouldn't we? For the first time in the history of the NSABB, this, by the way, is immediate. This is what the NSABB meeting looks like in practice, just to give you a visual. NSABB decided for the first time in its history to recommend that these studies should not be published. Certainly should not be published in the current form. And at this moment, we get the beginnings of a massive, protracted, and multi-year scientific controversy about these experiments. This controversy, or the H5N1 controversy as it's called, in a nutshell, revolves around three issues. Issue number one is, should these kind of experiments be carried out? Okay? Scientists say it's really important for us to understand how viruses acquire airborne transmission. If we know which mutations cause them to go airborne transmission, this will help us with surveillance, and this can also help us with designing vaccines, etc. People who are looking at this more from a security side said, this is just too dangerous. I mean, you're conferring this ability. If this gets out of the lab, what's going to happen? Might even be another pandemic, right? It's just too dangerous. Real fears that this was just irresponsible and too dangerous. And there's a kind of sub-debate here then also under which conditions should this be done, right? Scientific laboratories have different safety gradings. They kind of go from 1 at the bottom to 4 at the top, Maybe you say, yes, they should be done, but they should only be done at the highest, kind of most secret, kind of secure government laboratories. Should it be done at universities? Different questions there. But the first question was really, should it be done? How do you weigh up the scientific arguments against the security concern that these experiments provoked? Second argument, related but separate, irrespective of what your answer to the first question is, actually, let's just take a quick straw poll. Who thinks these experiments should be done? You have to decide yes or no. There's no abstaining. Okay. Who says they should not be done? Okay. Lovely. 50-50 split. So now you know why there was a controversy, right? So first question is, second question related is, should you then publish how you do it? Okay. So some people said, okay, maybe these are important experiments, but what you mustn't do is then tell the world how you did it. Again, you got really interesting arguments, right? Because the scientists are like, well, open publication is the cornerstone of science. We have to demonstrate openly our methods. Also for reproducibility, which is a cornerstone of science, you have to show how you've done it. The security people went, are you crazy? You're putting the recipe about how to create these dangerous viruses out there for everybody to see. What if our enemies get the recipe? Okay. So again, you kind of got scientific arguments, right, versus security arguments. Just to show you how heated this got, Ron, the tall guy, he submitted his manuscript to Science, the journal. The headquarters of the Science Journal are in Washington, D.C. The Dutch government, to prevent publication of the study, began to apply EU directives on biosecurity to Ron's manuscript. They're saying your manuscript, which contains this dangerous knowledge, is under our EU regulations going to be prevented from being exported. Sending it to the US to get it published constitutes export out of the EU. It's the first time in the history that these kind of EU directives had been applied to a manuscript. Okay? It shows you again the kind of security versus science, right? And of course, Ron was very upset about this, and the university backed him, and there was a legal challenge made by the Erasmus University to the expense. Okay, but here you can see, one of the many media stories that this generated. So first debate was, the first issue was, should you do this kind of research? Second issue is, should you publish it? Third issue was, who gets to actually decide all of these issues, right? So you had this complex things of different institutional actors. You had the scientists, right? The scientists, once the debate kicked off, said, okay, we're going to call a timeout. We're going to do a self-imposed moratorium for 60 days. We're going to stop doing this kind of research until we had the debate, right? You had the Americans thinking about, well, some of this research was funded by the National Institutes of Health. And yes, what's the role of the funding bodies? The journals are trying to figure out what's their role and responsibility in all of this. So you've got then the national government level, you've got the international government level, okay? So all this also then became the subject of a meeting by the World Health Organization. Ron, the tall guy, he had used a virus that came from Indonesia, okay? The Indonesians were really sensitive that when they share their viruses with the rest of the international community, they want to be party to the benefits that come from that scientific knowledge, okay? So if they decided to redact this information and not share it with the Indonesians, WHO would have a massive diplomatic crisis on its hands again, right? So for a number of different reasons, WHO comes out in favor of open publication. But it just, and whilst everybody's going on about Ron and Yoshi, it then quietly slips out that the Chinese have been at it as well. Here's Chen Hualan, who created over 120 different mutant viruses in her lab. Okay, so there's also the international picture, right? Can this actually be governed at an international level, and who decides? It's a long and messy story, but I think there are two key things that I want to say. The first thing is, eventually, the studies were published. NSABB reconvened. They got a security briefing in the meantime. They recommended some changes to the manuscripts, which the authors undertook. And eventually, both of the studies were published. And you can see this looks like quite a mundane. This is the study. Scientists, you always look at the last author. It's often the most important author. So you can see that's the Kawaoka paper. And this is the Ron Fouché paper. Okay? So first thing is, in the end, the studies were published. So all of you who thought it shouldn't be published, tough luck. They're out there. Anybody can look at them. But the second thing I want to say is how this controversy was publicly construed, right? The controversy really became one of what we might in abbreviated form call science versus security, right? It was basically a question of where does the freedom of science end, and where, if at all, does science have to make adjustments to accommodate security concerns, right? Should scientists not do particular experiments because the security risks are too big? Should scientists not publish particular things because the risks are too big? And should scientists or security people or those in charge of security have the final power to make these kinds of decisions? So the public controversy was very much one of kind of science versus security, quite an antagonistic debate. And I think it's actually nicely reflected in the split of votes that we had here. What I want to do now, though, is also dig a little bit beneath the surface of this controversy. Because although in public, this was very much a fight of kind of science versus security, I want to show that there are actually a lot of deeper interconnections at play here between science and security that are not immediately obvious, but which are really important. And kind of the impetus for this comes out of science and technology studies, which is a field that specifically studies the role of science in society. One particularly influential scholar there is Sheila Jasanoff, and she talks about the importance of understanding science through the idiom of co-production. So the idea here is very much that you cannot really divorce science from society, that the way in which we live our lives is very closely linked to what we know about ourselves and about the world. And so the idea of co-production is very much aimed at trying to get away either of ideas where you have a kind of scientific or technological determinism, where society just kind of follows new scientific discoveries or inventions, at the same time also getting beyond a kind of heavily post-structuralist understanding of science merely as text, but rather to understand the ways in which science and society co-constitute or co-produce one another. Now, they don't talk a lot about security, but I want to actually use this to also think about the relationship between science and security, and to get behind this kind of public controversy, which is a science versus security. Because when you begin to look at this from a co-productionist lens, you actually begin to discover that there are all kinds of thicker and deeper connections between science and security. So to give you one example, whereas the kind of conventional debates were very much about should we publish, should we do this kind of research, a kind of a co-productionist account might ask, well, how was it actually possible for these experiments to become intelligible and funded and carried out in the first place? What's the social context of these experiments? And once you begin to think this way, you get actually a slightly different picture. So the first thing that you have to know about both of these experiments that we talked about is that they were publicly funded. Okay, so you can begin to ask, well, where did the culture of public funding for science actually come from, especially in the United States? If you begin to go through history and you look back, you arrive roughly in the 1950s in a context of an intense geopolitical rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. And there was a particular event around Sputnik when the Soviets beat the Americans about putting an unmanned satellite into orbit. The American establishment panicked. The Soviets are big geopolitical rivals, are ahead of us in terms of their scientific achievements. And this led to a massive change in the culture of public funding for the sciences. So you get the creation of the White House Office of Science and Technology in the US, you get a quadrupling of funding for the National Science Foundation, you get huge investment in science. Okay? So this is the moment of this culture shift occurs within the context of a geopolitical rivalry. But it's still that culture of public funding born out of a security crisis from which these experiments benefited at a broad level. At a more specific level, I've just been talking about how security debates also then changed after the end of the Cold War. Whereas during the Cold War, security debates were very much about nuclear weapons, around this confrontation between the two superpowers. In a context of globalization, security became much more about flows and circulations and the new risks that brought once you begin to think in more global terms. And again, health security was a big part of this. The scientists actually played a key role in changing these things by putting out meetings and studies about emerging infectious disease threats. Yeah? So if you look, for example, at the security strategy of the US to deal with the threat of avian influenza and pandemic flu, it explicitly envisioned more science on these viruses. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that really, it's not really accurate to separate security and science out and portray them in these confrontational terms, because the whole experiments in the first place, their genesis and their funding only became possible in a wider security context. They were basically designed to assess the pandemic threat that H5N1 poses and whether it could become a pandemic. So you cannot divorce these experiments from this wider security context. You can also ask, then from thinking about this more through a lens of co-production, what are the political effects of the knowledge that these experiments created? Okay, so once Ron and Yoshi did the experiments and they generated this new knowledge, what was the societal significance of this knowledge? Well, the first thing it did was that it reconfirmed the security threat that H5N1 poses, right? Because both of them were able to show that it is possible for these viruses to become airborne transmissible. So it confirmed that yes, H5N1 is indeed a threat. More than that, they showed in both cases that it's only around a handful of mutations that are required for them to become airborne transmissible. And they were able to show that some of these mutations were already occurring naturally in nature. Right? So the political message of the experiments was very much one that actually pandemic flu is a real threat and we must continue to prepare for it. So the political effect of the knowledge that they created was actually to reinforce the security agenda around pandemic flu, providing the scientific evidence base that the threat is quote-unquote real. Not only did it shore up these threats about pandemic flu, but of course it also reinvigorated the whole debate about bioterrorism, right? Because they now had a recipe about how to create a dangerous new virus. And so at this point, the circulation of information itself also became a new threat. And the fact that this recipe now exists meant we had to think about who will get to see this recipe and who would not get to see it, right? So not only was the political effect of this knowledge to shore up the threat about pandemic threats, it actually also shored up or reinforced concerns about bioterrorism, because now there was a potential for a new type of bioweapon to be developed. So what's happening here is that what we're actually seeing is the public controversy is saying, ooh, this is a case of science versus security, kind of a conflict between the interests of two fields. We scratch beneath the surface, we actually see, well, the experiments only really became intelligible and fundable within the context of a wider set of security debates out of which they were born. And the effects of the knowledge that the scientific experiments generated was to shore up and reinforce these security concerns. So you get more processes around co-production. The two fields mutually actually reinforcing each other in subtle but powerful ways. But the experiments also did one last thing. Through the controversy, they also then actually began to open up a third new axis of biological danger. And that is that increasing security attention would now have to be paid to the risk of an accidental laboratory release. Before, we were just talking about natural outbreaks. We were talking about deliberate releases. On the back of these experiments, now we're also talking about accidental laboratory outbreaks. And so the controversy and the antagonism actually set off a chain of events whereby the US government now said, actually, we have to provide more oversight of this kind of science because the science itself is also dangerous. So you begin in 2012 under the Obama administration a new set of proposals for more oversight over scientific experiments. In 2014, the Obama administration actually halts all public funding for these kinds of scientific experiments, and not just on pandemic flu, but also those with the SARS virus, those on Ebola, and so forth, as they draw up new guidelines. Eventually, they came up with new guidelines about how to kind of govern these things. These guidelines apply to 7 types of gain-of-function research, they're called. So these are experiments that give dangerous pathogens the ability to do things that they don't already possess. So it might be like the airborne transmissibility in the case of H5N1, or it may be something that confers the ability on a pathogen not to be susceptible to a particular medicine, and so existing medicines might no longer work. There are different things you can do to these organisms which would be considered dangerous, and where there's going to be much more government oversight. And so slowly but gradually, we get a whole new set of security discourses about dual-use research of concern, new security practices focusing not just on natural outbreaks, not just on deliberate releases, but also on accidental releases that might occur from scientific laboratories. And I think here we kind of actually reach what I kind of call the zenith of co-production, right? Where now it's not just that science is serving as an arbiter of whether something is a security threat or not, but science itself is actually becoming the insecurity. Right? Science itself is now something against which we must also be secured in the 21st century. And this is what I meant when I said at the very beginning that science, the role of science in security is not just important, it's constitutive. What it means to be secure in the 21st century can no longer be divorced also from the risks posed by science itself. So let me just conclude in the last couple minutes. I think there are really only three things that I want to say by conclusion. The first is that I think although the public controversy around these experiments focused very much on the kind of competing interests of security concerns versus those of science, what for me is interesting is all the stuff that's going on beneath the surface of that controversy and the way the fields of science and security actually mutually reinforce and co-produce one another and feed back into one another in complex but fascinating ways. And if that is true, then I think it also means that we cannot just think of science as something that plays an important role. We should pay some attention to it, but it's not that important. I would say I would be more radical and say it plays a constitutive role. It's now bound up with what we mean by security in the 21st century. And I would say that this is true actually not just for the life sciences. This is the second thing I want to say. It's actually true for many other sciences as well. So I've talked today just about what kind of Anglo-Saxon parlance we call the life sciences, which is biology, molecular biology. But there are many other sciences where similar stuff is going on. So we have quantum mechanics and physics, right? So go to physics. You have people trying to design the first quantum computer, which would drastically increase the power of mathematical calculation. And you could help solve many big problems that require analysis of huge numerical or other data sets. At the same time, there are concerns that you could use these kind of computers to create new systems of encryption that would be beyond the capabilities of what the state can actually decode, or that the same technologies could actually be used to also undermine existing encryption systems. So again, on the one hand, we have this prospect of scientific advance, but we also have new dangers that comes with it. We can look at the neuro or the brain sciences, right? Again, we're getting new understandings of the brain, new ways of dealing with neurological conditions, but there are also more nefarious applications you can use to influence people's minds, to make people more aggressive or carry out particular things or acts of aggression that they would not otherwise carry out, or even perhaps modulate their memory of these, erase the kind of memories of these kinds of events. You're also getting, in the nanosciences, new nanotechnologies, promising to be able to operate and enter the body in ways to manage disease that could, again, bring great progress, but could also be weaponized as a way of creating new weapons to target other soldiers or have other more nefarious applications. So this constitutive relationship between science and security is not just present in the life science and these H5N1 experiments, but it's actually a much wider phenomenon that's happening today across many sciences. The last thing I want to then conclude on is also what are some of the kind of theoretical or methodological implications of this? Because if the argument about the constitutive role of science is true, then I think it also has theoretical implications. And it means actually that any theory of security that tries to isolate security from its wider social environment is going to encounter quite serious limitations. So this is certainly the case, I would say, for mainstream theories. If you think about realism and the realist approach to security, it's not that realists ignore science and technology. Actually, for realists, science and technology is important, but it's a second-order thing. Security comes from the structural condition of anarchy for realists. Science and technology can affect the distribution of power within the international system. For example, if a country acquires nuclear weapons, right, so it becomes important, but it doesn't actually shape the core institution of security itself. So what I'm trying to say is that actually, if you look at something like science, it does actually shape the core of security as well. The same is also true actually of some more critical theories of security. So if you look at, for example, securitization theory, which is very influential, although that's more of a kind of socially constructivist theory, it actually also has quite a fixed definition. They have a kind of speech act grammar that they map out and end up with quite a fixed definition of security. I think many people have been trying to apply this kind of securitization framework to other areas, whether it's health or climate, are actually finding that the meaning of security itself also changes when these issues become securitized. Some people have talked about the medicalization of security in the field of health. In the field of climate change, people have talked about the climatization of security. Others have talked about the ethicalization of security. So I think what these people are picking up in different ways is that actually security itself also changes through these social processes. And so I think the idea of co-production, which comes from STS, can actually be also a methodological way of trying to capture these kind of bi- or multi-directional tendencies in a way that maybe some existing, although influential theories of security cannot. And that was exactly 59 minutes and 50 seconds. Thank you.